Hello, Brovs. We're back with The Madness of Mary Lincoln by Jason Emerson, a 2000 book which deals with the insanity trial and the aftermath of Mary Todd Lincoln and her relationship with her son who had her committed. Chapter 10, this is the last chapter, and then there's a prologue and then indexes and that sort of thing, but we'll finish off the book here first. Robert Lincoln was a private man who did not believe that personal facets of his parents' lives should be made public. As the last male Lincoln, he owned all of his father's personal and political papers. There was a famous claim by Nicholas Murray Butler, a friend of Robert's, president of Columbia University, that he witnessed Robert burn his father's letters. Subsequent historians have generally credited this allegation, although Robert Lincoln's attorney Frederick N. Towers made a similar claim of being witness to correspondence burning. Robert did admit to burning a number of his mother's letters written during the period of her mental derangement, as he called it, but the eldest Lincoln's son was not ignorant of his father's historical importance, nor was he averse to sharing his family with posterity. However, he did insist on choosing what parts of his family's history would be preserved. Robert occasionally lent some of his father's papers to museums for special exhibits, but mostly he kept them securely locked away in his home. Prior to his death in July 1926, Robert Lincoln bequeathed all his father's papers to the American people to be held in trust by the Library of Congress. A condition of his deed was that the papers would be sealed from public view until 21 years after his death. Robert stated this was because some of the people mentioned in the papers were still living, and it would not be proper to expose them to public scrutiny. Many historians believe the condition was a way for Robert to thwart historian Albert Beveridge's access to the papers, about which Beveridge had been pestering Robert for years. After her husband's death, Mary Harlan Lincoln continued Robert's tradition of upholding and augmenting the public memory and legacy of Abraham Lincoln by donating more family materials to the Library of Congress and also by denying public access to private family materials. The one historian Mary Harlan Lincoln did trust was Robert's cousin and Mary's dear friend, Catherine Helm. Helm, the daughter of Mary Todd Lincoln's half-sister, Emily Todd Helm, was writing the first and only authorized biography of Mary Todd Lincoln, which she commenced with Robert's approval and continued with his and his wife's aid. They often gave her access to family papers and letters only a handful of other people had ever seen, including some materials that have since disappeared and therefore now can only be found in her book. Given this closeness and trust, it is therefore no surprise that when Mary Harlan Lincoln received an unexpected visitor in October 1927 bearing news of the impending publication of a history of her mother-in-law's insanity case, she wrote a letter to Catherine Helm to inform her. At that time, Helm was still in the process of writing her biography. My dear Miss Helm, we had quite a surprise party last Wednesday, and Mrs. Lincoln has asked that I write to you and tell you about it. The letter written by Lincoln attorney Frederick Towers began, it continued. A Miss Stewart Myra Pritchard called here with her attorney. It seems that Mrs. Pritchard is the granddaughter of Judge Bradwell of Chicago, to whom and to whose wife, Myra Bradwell, Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, addressed many letters during her lifetime. Now, the point is this. Mrs. Pritchard contemplates the publication of this material in the form of a biographical sketch, and while, of course, she does not have to ask anyone's permission to do so, the purpose of her visit here was to inform Mrs. Lincoln of her intention, which I think is very decent of her. She tacitly agreed to submit to Mrs. Lincoln's inspection anything she might wish to publish, and Mrs. Lincoln, I believe, rather feels as I do, namely, that it is better to have Mrs. Pritchard as a friend than to offend her. So she has agreed tentatively to see Mrs. Pritchard in Washington. In fact, Mary Harlan Lincoln not only agreed to meet with Mrs. Pritchard in Washington, D.C., and inspect the 111 page manuscript, but also suggested that she might be able to add information from her own files. This statement, as borne out by later events, was intended to keep her in Myra Pritchard's good graces while she decided how best to handle the situation. Yet, far from aiding Myra Pritchard in her publication endeavors, Mary Harlan Lincoln thwarted her. Towers and his partner, Norman B. Frost, upon their meeting with Myra Pritchard in December 1927, were confronted with the most unprecedented cache of materials relating to Mary Todd Lincoln. What do you got, bruv? Ever found. It must be noted that up to 1927, no book had been published that was written solely about Mary Lincoln, and there was only one book about Abraham Lincoln that even mentioned his wife's insanity trial. Myra Pritchard, Myra Bradwell's granddaughter, purportedly owned 37 letters of correspondence from Mary Todd Lincoln to Myra and James Bradwell. These letters span the period from 1872 to 1878. Oh, I skipped somewhere along the line here. The majority of them directly relating to Mary's 1875 commitment to the sanitarium. And this is Abraham Lincoln's daughter-in-law, Mary Harlan Lincoln, who was married to Robert Lincoln, Lincoln's son. Myra Pritchard also owned Mary Todd Lincoln's 1873 will, the one written by James Bradwell and never probated. From these materials, Myra Pritchard had written her book, The Dark Days of Abraham Lincoln's Will, as revealed by her own letters. She already had secured a publishing contract from J.H. Sears and Company to print her work in 9 installments in Liberty magazine, for which she was paid $5,000. Towers and Frost entered their meeting knowing Robert Lincoln had, for a while, sought to collect and destroy all his mother's letters relating to her mental illness. He did this to protect not only his mother's reputation, but also his own, for he knew, as no one else did, the malicious and hurtful and even untrue statements his mother made to and about him as revenge for his actions. As Frost and Towers saw, Pritchard's letters revealed exactly what Robert had tried to suppress, a woman of dramatic mood swings and temperament, whose letters varied from tender and loving to hectic and neurotic, to accusatory, paranoid, and downright vicious. As Myra Pritchard later wrote, one can readily see why the Robert Lincolns would not want these letters published. And here's Myra Helmer Pritchard, the woman who was writing the first book on Mary Todd Lincoln's insanity. After 2 days of meeting with Myra Pritchard and reading through the materials, Frost and Towers found 3 letters written by Mary Todd Lincoln they found objectionable to print. Initially, Frost and Pritchard discussed the possibility of eliding, I don't know that word, these letters from her manuscript because Mary Harlan Lincoln felt it would be unfair and objectionable to print them. Pritchard agreed to give the objectionable letters to the attorneys on the condition that they agreed not to press any legal rights they might have under the Wilson case, a recent court decision that the writer of a letter and his or her succeeding heirs and not the recipient was the actual owner. After taking a night to think it over, Pritchard told Frost that taking out the 3 letters in question would somewhat divest the story of its commercial value. Since Mary Harlan Lincoln would not consent to publication of the article without revisions, Frost suggested that the entire manuscript Original letters and any copies should be sold either to the Lincoln family or to some friendly publishing company to be revised, printed, or destroyed as might be seen fit. Pritchard then left Washington to discuss the proposal and the matter of price with her attorney. One can only imagine the dejection the pressure to give up her manuscript must have caused Myra Pritchard, especially considering it was a situation of her own creation. Scholarship concerning Abraham Lincoln still was in its infancy in 1927, and aside from occasional newspaper articles, practically nothing had been written about Mary Todd Lincoln, especially not about her insanity trial. Pritchard therefore was sitting on a gold mine of historical material, both from a financial and a literary standpoint. The publication of her manuscript would not only garner her a handsome royalty check, but also would immediately catapult her name and her writing into national prominence. Chicago Judge Henry Horner, one of the greatest collectors of Lincolniana, Lincolniana, is that how you say it? Lincolniana, told Pritchard after he examined her grandparents' correspondence with Mary Lincoln that it would have an unquestioned bearing on the phases of history in which Mary Lincoln played a part. As Pritchard's attorney, Otis Rockwood, wrote to Towers at the end of the year, "Of course, Mrs. Pritchard is very anxious to become better known as an authoress, and therefore she desires keenly to have this article published." Yet 1 week later, the two sides had agreed to a full sale of the material, and all copies for the price of $22,500, a compromise between the $20,000 Mary Harlan Lincoln felt appropriate and the $25,000 Myra Pritchard thought reasonable. The sale was conditional upon authentication of the letters by a handwriting expert, which was secured and confirmed in late January 1928 from the examiner of questioned documents at the U.S. Treasury Department. The actual contract of sale, executed on January 31st, 1928, set the conditions that the manuscript, all connected letters, and all copies in Myra Pritchard's possession be turned over to Mary Harlan Lincoln, that no other person had any copies of the materials, that no other copies of the materials existed, that if Myra Pritchard subsequently attained any other Lincoln family letters, they would be turned over to the Lincoln family, that Myra Pritchard would not publish, permit, or cause to be published any of the manuscript or letters in her possession, and that if any of the materials were published or offered for sale, in whole or part, by anyone who secured possessions through Myra Pritchard, the contract would be voided, and she would be required to repay the Lincoln family the amount of purchase. "The contract sews her up as tight as a drum," observed Carl Harriman, the vice president of Myra Pritchard's publishers, J.H. Sears and Company. Once he was informed of it. In point of fact, I think if she is apprehending reading a book about Lincoln, or mentioning his name or the name of his lady, she is likely to subject herself thereby to imprisonment for life, if indeed not summary execution. What? They were going to kill her if she wrote another book or even read one? All right. Myra Pritchard and the general manager of Liberty Weekly, Inc., signed a contract dissolving their previous publishing agreement in January 1928. Myra Pritchard was unhappy about the sale, and in March 1928 drew up a statement regarding her disposal of the Mary Lincoln letters. Are you really going to say yo again? Drew up a statement regarding her disposal of the Mary Lincoln letters. These letters, along with some other Lincoln relics, were given to me some 8 or 9 years before my mother's death, with the stipulation that I should write about them, but not until both my mother and Robert Lincoln should have passed on. The statement reads, "My mother was most anxious that these letters be published because she felt that Mrs. Abraham Lincoln had been maligned and that these letters would explain much of the real Mrs. Lincoln to the world and place her in a more favorable light. Of course, Pritchard understood why the Lincoln family did not want the letters published, as they offered intimate and embarrassing views into the private lives of a very private family. But still, she tried her best to convince the Lincolns to release the publication rights. I finally sold them to Frost and Towers, attorneys for Mrs. Robert Lincoln, for $22,500, she wrote. The value of these letters would have been infinitely more before Robert Lincoln's death in 1926. She did not know what Mary Harlan Lincoln intended to do with the letters, but she assumed they would be destroyed. Interestingly, the Pritchards and the Lincolns were not the only people to know of the existence of the insanity letters. Myra Bradwell showed the letters to at least one other person, and Myra Pritchard had either spoken of them or shown them to at least three other people. Other historians also discovered their existence through hearsay. In late November 1928, Pritchard received letters from two different people. One asking for access to the letters, the other asking for their donation to the Library of Congress. Pritchard wrote to Frederick Towers and asked him how she should respond, stating, "It is my desire to protect your interests in every way I can." Towers suggested she answer honestly and simply say the papers have passed out of your hands. Myra Pritchard also continued to uphold her part of the contract agreement when, in 1932, she donated other Lincoln items in her possession on a call loan basis to the Chicago Historical Society for public display. Pritchard loaned the society a number of authentic Lincoln-related items that Mary Todd Lincoln had given to Myra Bradwell, including President Lincoln's definition of democracy. In his own handwriting, a gold pen with which Mary claimed Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a bloodstone seal presented by the Sultan of Turkey to President Lincoln, as well as a legal document and message to Congress in Abraham Lincoln's handwriting. Eleanor Gridley, a longtime friend of Myra Bradwell, submitted a sworn affidavit to the effect that the items were genuine. Pritchard wrote in a letter to L.H. Shattuck, Chicago Historical Society director, that if the affidavit mentioned the insanity letters, I should not want that on record or any public comment made of it. If it does mention these items, I will get another affidavit from Mrs. Gridley, omitting the Mrs. Lincoln correspondence. At 12:01 a.m. on July 26, 1947, the Robert Todd Lincoln collection of the papers of Abraham Lincoln, stored in the Library of Congress since 1919, were opened to the public. The opening caused nationwide interest in media coverage, as no historians had examined the complete collection since John Hay and John Nicolai in the late 19th century. After all the excitement and the furor of the opening and all the revelations of the materials in the collection, one big disappointment was that the papers contained only one letter, either to or from Mary Todd Lincoln. An article in Life magazine asked the trenchant question, "What then has happened to her letters?" The insanity letters, in fact, still existed. Not only were many in the possession of Frederick Towers, the Lincoln family attorneys, but they also were in the possession of Myra Pritchard, who, despite the stringent agreement she had signed with Mary Harlan Lincoln, had kept typewritten copies of all the Mary Lincoln letters in her own unpublished manuscript. Upon Myra Pritchard's death in February 1947, her daughter, Margaretta Pritchard, opened her mother's safety deposit box and found within a parceled label, "In case of my death, this is to be destroyed immediately." The parcel contained the entire 1928 Liberty Magazine manuscript. After Margaretta Pritchard read the manuscript, she told her family members her intention and personally burned the contents and entirely consumed the same in flames. She did not, however, burn the typewritten copies of the letters. Instead, she approached Oliver R. Barrett, a prominent Chicago attorney and one of the foremost Lincoln collectors in America, to ask his advice on whether or not she should publish the letters her mother had kept secret for 19 years. There are no records explaining why Margarita Pritchard considered publishing the letters despite her mother's previous contract with the Lincoln family, and there is no way to know how the Lincolns would have reacted. Mary Harlan Lincoln had died in 1937, but her children and grandchildren were still alive, as was Frederick Towers, the attorney who negotiated the deal and still had the papers in his possession. Barrett advised Margarita Pritchard that the letters should not be published, that they had absolutely no historical value, and would be of benefit only to someone who desired to read the rantings of an insane person. Barrett also told Margarita Pritchard's attorney to thoroughly search her belongings to obtain the typewritten copies of the letters, the manuscript, and any evidence of the fact that the originals were sold to the Lincoln family. He then feels that we should take these typewritten copies and tie them together securely and place a screw through the middle of them, and then get in touch with the librarian of the Library of Congress and the president of the Chicago Historical Society, and in their presence have the same destroyed. Barrett felt it would not be exactly morally right to publish letters that Robert Lincoln so aggressively sought to keep private and unpublished during his life, in which his family had taken the time and expense to purchase, presumably so they could be destroyed. He also felt such destruction would increase the value of the Robert Lincoln collection that had recently opened in the Library of Congress. Its value had been cast into doubt by the above-mentioned Life magazine article, which had questioned whether the Library of Congress actually had the complete collection of Lincoln papers left by Robert Lincoln, or whether they had purged it of detrimental items such as the insanity letters. Barrett suggested that destroying the letters would be rendering a great service and would put the question to rest once and for all. Margarita Pritchard's attorney agreed with Barrett for the same reasons and urged her to destroy the letters, which she ultimately did. The lore and lure of the letters continued, however, in September 1949, while in the midst of composing her Mary Lincoln biography, Ruth Painter Randall received word of the letters in the possession of the Pritchard family. Randall's friend, Henrietta Horner, the wife of Lincoln scholar Harlan Hoyt Horner, wrote to her, "Perhaps you have gotten on the trail of a series of letters written by Mrs. Lincoln to Mrs. Myra Bradwell, the woman who secured Mrs. Lincoln's release from Batavia. Mrs. Eleanor Gridley wrote me about the existence of these letters, which she had been allowed to read, and which she was sure were preserved by the Bradwell family in Chicago. None of them have ever been published or quoted, so far as I know. No evidence has been found suggesting Randall made any effort or had any luck finding or securing the letters, other than the statement in her book that the letters had vanished. So what did Mary Harlan Lincoln do with the letters and the manuscript once she acquired them? As with so many historical actions and so many things regarding the family of Abraham Lincoln, it remains a mystery. The fact that they were not included in Robert Lincoln's personal insanity file, nor found at the Lincolns' Vermont home, indicates Mary Harlan Lincoln did indeed destroy them, as Myra Pritchard supposed. But if she did destroy them, then why did her attorney, Frederick Towers, keep copies of them? And did Mary Harlan Lincoln know of the copies he kept? Numerous historians have wandered over and searched for the letters for decades, as evidenced in Myra Pritchard's attempt to publish the letters in 1928. The searches by Mary Lincoln biographers Evans, 1928, Randall, 1953, and the Turners, 1972, as well as the current Ghosts of the Library presentation at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. When I began my research for my impending biography of Robert T. Lincoln, I had no idea or intention of finding them. My initial discovery began in March 2005 while doing research on Robert at his home, Hildene in Manchester, Vermont. I discovered two letters written by Frederick Towers about Myra Pritchard's visit to Hildene. The one quoted above to Catherine Helm and another to Myra Pritchard, arranging the Washington, D.C. meeting between the two parties. While looking for Bradwell Pritchard family descendants, I read a biography of Myra Bradwell called America's First Woman Lawyer by Jane M. Friedman, which contained an entire chapter describing the sale of the insanity letters based on primary Pritchard family information. Friedman described in her prologue how she tracked down Myra Pritchard's distant relative, James Gordon, who had legal documentation concerning the letter sale episode and its aftermath. Mr. Gordon did not have the insanity letters or the book manuscript, but still had the legal correspondence and files relating to the materials and the Mary Harlan Lincoln episode. There's Frederick N. Towers, Robert T. Lincoln's attorney. How old was this guy? Realizing that the story was a legal affair and knowing none of the insanity materials were anywhere in any Lincoln collections that I could find, I wondered about the files of the Lincoln family attorneys. Could they have kept something? A few months later, a total of 5 months after I found the first two letters at Hildene, I spoke with Frederick C. Towers on the telephone in early August 2005. He told me that during a recent move, he had uncovered an old steamer trunk labeled FN Towers Lincoln papers that belonged to his father. The trunk was filled with hundreds of legal papers of Robert T. and Mary Harlan Lincoln, but included as well were materials pertaining to Mary Todd Lincoln's insanity episode. Towers had found not only photographic and handwritten copies of numerous letters by Mary Lincoln, but also all the legal documentation of sale by Myra Pritchard to Mary Harlan Lincoln, as well as Pritchard's entire unpublished manuscript. Towers and his siblings were at that point deciding what to do with them, whether to keep them, sell them, or donate them to a Lincoln-related museum. Steamer trunk owned by Frederick N. Towers, in which Mary Lincoln's lost insanity letters were discovered in 2005. After much discussion and follow-up, Frederick C. Towers and his siblings allowed me to write the story of their letters. I asked Towers why he thought his father kept copies of the insanity letters and whether he believed Mary Harlan Lincoln knew he had them. He had no firm answer, yet he supposed that his father probably kept the documents, the letters, and the Pritchard manuscript without Mary Harlan Lincoln's knowledge or consent. He did not believe his father did this out of spite, but rather out of a sense of duty to posterity. More than likely, the reason was that Robert Lincoln's attorney, Frederick N. Towers, according to his son, personally witnessed Robert Lincoln's burning family letters, and as he vehemently opposed such destruction, he may have decided to save the insanity materials to prevent still more historical loss. The truth, most likely, will never be known. Frederick Towers' preservation of what have since become known as Mary Lincoln's lost insanity letters was, in fact, an enormous contribution to posterity, and for that he and his family should be thanked, and his spirit should be rightly proud. How many pages of this is there? It's quite a bit of pages, Bubba. That's a lot of pages. That's all the letters. Damn, a lot of letters. What's the epilogue? How many pages? I'll read these later. I shall read them later, bruvs. That's all.